So we will be focusing on the AWS DevSecOps. So in this demo, we'll be focusing on what are we going to cover in this course and setting the right expectation, right? Because we have the audience from various backgrounds. I understand that we have people from various backgrounds have joined for the demo. Since it is very leading course in the market, right? It is something which has very good job opportunities across worldwide. So we are focusing on the hands-on experience on the AWS DevOps since it is from various background people. We'll be setting the right expectation in this course. I'll be explaining you what we will be covering in this course and how much the duration and with the detailed introduction about each and every topic. Just a demo on how I'm going to. This first demo session, I had to prepare PPT because initial jargons you might need to understand. I cannot directly take you to the hands-on first demo itself. So I'm just going to take you through the topics and setting you the right expectation and making you to understand some of the jargons related to DevSecOps, right? In this, DevSecOps thing. Why are we here? I told you, you all must be interested to know about who is a trainer. First of all, I've introduced myself, and then I've also heard about you guys. We have a wider audience here with the various background. That's perfectly nice. And we need to set the right expectation. How are we going to set the right expectation? What are we going to learn here? It's like it, it's a too wider area when we say DevSecOps, right? People might be knowing about DevOps. What is DevOps? You might know already, right? But what is even if you don't know, don't worry. I'm gonna take you through all your basic understanding. But what is DevSecOps? That's what we're gonna understand, right? So and second thing is DevSecOps on cloud is very important thing I'm pointing out always. Why? Because nowadays no one is gonna do all this stuff in on-premises. Everybody deploying their resources on cloud, right? So we need to understand the importance of DevSecOps in the modern IT infrastructure. What is modern IT infrastructure? Which is mostly on the cloud. So when we say cloud, you do not have the very detailed expertise in terms of hardware, in terms of detailed networking. You don't have to. Why? Because everything is being managed by the cloud provider. When we say cloud, we have multiple providers in market, right? We have AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud, IBM Cloud, many things, right? But right now, what we are focusing here is AWS Cloud because that is one of the major market leader, right? So why we have picked AWS Cloud is when you go and look at the job market that we have more openings in. Just a minute, guys. We need to look at the AWS Cloud and then we'll see for the learning outcome. When we say learning outcome, end of the course, you must be able to take any kind of project which needs DevSecOps implementation on AWS, right? So what is DevSecOps with AWS? So DevSecOps, when I say it's not just one area. You need to know about the cloud automation. You need to know about the DevOps services. You need to know about the observability. What is observability? I've mentioned here, right? What is observability? Observability, as in, like, let's say, you have observability, as in, let's say, you have thousands of server and server is underperforming or lack of resources or anything. You should be able to get some notification which server is underperforming, which server is lagging. So the observability is kind of a monitoring that you are trying to set up for the infrastructure. DevSecOps, basically, what is DevSecOps? Now you are giving a secured environment to your developer where developer can develop their code and you are giving you the platform where which is fully protected, which cannot be easily cracked by the outsider, right? So how? That's the part we are going to cover, right? And SRE and chaos engineering, basically people might not be aware about. So what is SRE? Nowadays I'm coming to the terminology called SRE, chaos engineering. So those are the practices that we need to make sure when our system is live in production, we need to ensure our platform is operating without any issues. How will it operate without any issues? When we have all this setup, the observability, DevSecOps, DevOps services, automation, everything is in place, then the SRE is going to be coming into the picture. So SRE makes sure your infrastructure is properly running without any hassle, right? So that's a practice that we're going to do, right? The DevOps services, basically, we call it as starting from the coding, ending with the deployment of the coding. Right. So DevOps services and cloud automation is something we have all our infrastructure nowadays on cloud. So the entire cloud infrastructure cannot be done manually. We need to do automation. So we know cloud very well. If we think that we need to automate it, why? Because our infrastructure, usually when we say DevOps engineer or DevSecOps engineer or cloud engineer or cloud platform engineer, you need to know cloud automation. Why? Because you cannot go and do it manually. Manually, where whatever that you're doing is going to be a rework, right? So it's not going to be once in a while we are going to do it. We are going to repeatedly do that. When we wanted to repeatedly do that, right? We need to do the cloud automation, right? And also cloud native development, which is Microsoft. So we don't have to do kind of any development. We are not going to focus on any coding here. In this code, we're not going to focus on any programming language. We'll be focusing on Linux shell scripting. We'll be focusing on cloud automation scripting using Terraform. But we are not going to write any Java code or Python code or something. It's a good to have skill basically. Guys. When you say, "Hey Santosh, I wanted to understand, do we need a programming skill for DevSecOps people?" It is always good to have, but what is mandatory is at least one scripting language. So we are going to learn the shell scripting. We also need to know about cloud automation language. So we are going to learn about Terraform in this, right? So I'll tell you what are the things we'll be covering in this course. Yeah, DevSecOps includes DevOps plus security. So what is DevOps? If you don't know, I'll tell you like what is DevOps. DevOps is basically a kind of nowadays we are bringing it as a practice. It's not a tool or technology; it's a culture. DevOps is basically a culture that we have it in our IT industry, which is brought into the recent software development methodology, which is agile methodology. So earlier we have the software development methodology called as waterfall methodology and different methodologies we had it. There are a lot of pros and cons in that, but to overcome that, we have brought the agile methodology nowadays, right? So when we have the agile methodology of software development, which is a continuous development, it's like a develop base product and then continuously release a feature on the existing product. So that's a development part. We're not going to do any kind of development. We have the developers to do the development, but we need to ensure the platform is given for them in a automated. The DevOps comes into the picture where the operation part of the development, right? Like maintaining the repository, maintaining all your code, ensuring a code is being compiled, tested, deployed into the server automatically, how the infrastructure is being managed. All these informations are actually a DevOps practice. So this is included in DevSecOps. What is coming additionally is the security aspect of it. What is security aspect? Let's say you're developing a code. Your code is going to get deployed into a Docker container, a small server environment. The server should be secured. So whatever the code that you have developed, deployed environment, right, is basically vulnerable free. I'm going to tell you about. So the difference between DevOps and the DevSecOps, I've just explained you, which is DevOps plus the security aspect of it. But I'll cover that in detail about what are the security aspects we are going to see that we will see here, right? Before that, we need to understand. So every time when I mention, I've mentioned it DevSecOps on cloud. Maybe you can come out of this DevOps on cloud. So whatever the DevOps that we're implementing, so most of the company, if you take any of the job description for the DevOps or cloud engineer or anything that you take, right, that comes with cloud skill is mandatory for everyone. Why? Because all the tools and technology that we're using, which is on cloud nowadays. So you should understand at least one cloud. So why we have brought cloud concept here is cloud concept is mandatory for all the DevOps engineer, right? So you need to understand at least one cloud, either AWS, Azure, GCP, any of the cloud. But what we have in this course is for focusing on the AWS concepts, right? So on AWS, there are fundamentals that you need to understand first of all, right? So if you want to learn about AWS fundamentals, there are some free courses as well online about what is AWS and few services. But in this course, what we are going to cover is with a hands-on, how are we going to understand the AWS cloud? To get started with the DevOps, right? How are we going to, work with all the services in AWS is what we will be focusing. So we'll focus on how to provision the EC2 server, how to create the networks, how to create the subnet, what is NAT gateway, what is the internet gateway. So various infrastructure components we will cover here first. What is auto scaling? What is load balancing? how are we going to configure those infrastructure on cloud is what we will cover here. Why that is essential? Because any DevOps engineer who is going to deploy the server services, that they should know about the AWS concepts. Also, we will cover about how are we going to automate using Terraform, right? So whatever that we are doing on AWS, we are not going to do it by manual operations nowadays. No more manual operations. In any company, if you go and look at the job description, they will clearly mention it. People should know the cloud automation. So you need to understand how are we going to automate this cloud infrastructure, cloud deployment, or anything, which is using Terraform. So we'll see how are we going to automate using Terraform. So I'll tell you, like, how to write the Terraform code to automate some of the services, right? Any cloud, if you learn in parallel, if you learn about the cloud automation, which is really a good skill, right? So that part we'll be covering here. So what are the services we'll cover with AWS is something that about cloud services provide infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. But in this, we'll be talking about IAM, which is a security service, right? Since it's a DevSecOps, you need to understand about how are we going to give the user access control, how are we going to create the users, policies, roles, and the security controls for the users. And we'll also talk about the networking component, VPC, subnet, all kind of networking component, and then we talk about storage component on cloud, and then the compute services, which is server management, EC2, load balancing, auto scaling, and few things. As I mentioned, here is a way where we will be seeing about the automation, right? How are we going to automate the services in order to manage via code, that Terraform, right? And then once you know about the infrastructure component, the very important aspect is you need to understand about the operating system, right? So we need to understand about the Linux operating system as well, because most widely in the market it is being used. So you need to understand what is Linux and how we will work with Linux. Any operation that you're trying to perform inside Linux, you need to understand about the inside of the Linux, right? You need to understand about the command. How are we going to automate using shell scripting? All the aspects we will talk, right? What are the topics we'll be covering? We'll be covering about the basic commands, how we will work with Linux commands day to day. Let's say if Linux became your operating system, how are we going to work with Linux system day to day, right? In Windows, you guys are very familiar. You know, we have the GUI. We'll go click on the folder, create the file, manage everything, install the files, everything we know in Windows. But how are we going to manage all these things in the Linux operating system, right? And then we also talk about file management, permission management, disk management, all these operations. So once you're comfortable with the Linux, we'll also talk about the shell script, right? Very important concept is the shell scripting. Why? Because DevOps engineer need to know one scripting language. So any kind of task that I'm trying to give you, you should be able to write a script, right? How are you going to write a shell scripting? So any operation that I'm giving, hey, let's say we have a log server tomorrow, and let's say 500 servers we have it. We need to aggregate all the logs and put some kind of formatting, and then execute some scripts inside a Linux machine. When I say a bigger task for the wider, servers, right? How will you automate? You cannot go and do it manually. How are you going to automate it? So when you wanted to do that, you need to know the shell scripting part. So how the shell scripting is going to work, you'll understand. So once we're done, we will definitely be able to start looking at the networking basis, because why networking is important? Because we are not going to use anything on premises. You are not going to go to office and work with the physical servers. You are going to work with the cloud servers. Nowadays all the resources are present in different locations, right? You have your server in US, and how will you make sure the networking is properly configured, and you are able to troubleshoot when there is a issue in that, at least some networking troubleshooting that you need to know. So we will understand about the networking basics, how we will create. So this is not a separate topic. Those all these things will talk when we are talking about the AWS networking itself. So when we say AWS networking, right, we need to create a VPC, we need to create a subnet, we need to create a gateway, we need to create a route table and things like that. So if you guys don't understand a lot of terms what I'm talking about, don't worry, guys. We will talk about each and everything in detail. But all these things are needed for you to understand to work, to start with the networking problem, right? So you need to know about the how the IP addressing works, what is the IDR block, the side that we call it as, right? So what is the IDR, and what is a public IP address, private IP address, how we will do the subnetting, how we will try to reach out from one network to other network, how do we ensure the DNS servers works, and fundamentals of the networking we will talk about, right? So all what I've spoken so far is about the cloud, networking, operating system, pure infrastructure things, right? And then we get into the actual DevOps things, right? So the DevOps concept comes with a lot of things, right? So we start with continuous development, continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous deployment, continuous monitoring, right? So that involves various tools. When we say continuous development, the developer is going to develop their code, maybe a Java code or Python code or anything, right? So that code has to get stored somewhere. So that is about version control system, where let's say 500 developers are developing their code into one project. Where the code will go, it will eventually go to one place. How multiple developers are going to work with one code base, right? And how the conflicts are going to get resolved, how the branching is going to work, how are we going to set up the local deployment environment, the production deployment environment. So all these operations you need to understand when it comes to DevOps, because that's where the DevOps concept lies, right? So to get started with, we'll understand about the version control system. We'll talk about how Git works. We'll create our GitHub account. We'll start working with Git operations. I'll tell you about how the flow is going to be, how we will create the branches and things like that, right? And then once the code is developed, what is the next step? So once the code is being pushed into the remote repository, the code, automatically the flow should start building your code, right? So the last point I've mentioned is automate the build with Jenkins, right? So how we are going to make sure the code is being pushed into the repository automatically, it will trigger the CI. That's where the integration with CI comes into the picture, right? We will have to integrate with the CI. What is CI? It is a continuous integration where we're going to see a tool called as Jenkins. So Jenkins is a tool we will see about CI and CD. What is CI and CD? Which is continuous integration and continuous deployment, right? So when you say continuous integration and continuous, where are we going to use it? Hey, whatever you're talking, Santosh, I don't even understand where it will, right? Some people may have it in your mind, but don't worry about it. It's all about software development practices. It's all about, like, day to day, how the companies are operating. It's not about just coding your software, right? Right. So beyond that, we have a hell lot of stuff to do in the background. So software developer is one role where they develop the code, they focus on, like, developing the product. But around that, we have a lot of stuff into the market, right? So we have to manage the code. We need to ensure the code is automatically compiled, tested, and then deployed. So we have different tools for different operations. Jenkins is one of the CI/CD tool. We have multiple tools in the market, guys. We have cloud-based tool. We have open source tool. Lot of tools in the market. What we are going to focus on Jenkins, because in the market widely used is Jenkins. Right. So we will see how we will, create the pipeline, how we will integrate the CI with the, version control system, how will we integrate with Docker containers, right? So that part we will talk about. So what is Docker? When I say Docker, the next slide I have it is for Docker. So we will learn about Docker and Kubernetes. Docker and Kubernetes is one of the very cutting edge technology that we have in the market right now, right? So Docker and Kubernetes is basically a containerization technology, guys. Whoever doesn't understand what is Docker and Kubernetes, you can imagine, let's say I have developed the application, right? That application I wanted to deploy. So one application, in the earlier scenario, we used to develop a monolithic application, right? One application we deployed into one server. But nowadays, the application deployment is not going to be one, and it's not going to be one server. So we'll divide it into microservices, right? So we develop a project. Let's say we'll take an example of Amazon.com or Flipkart.com, anything. We will have all the products, catalog all into one product, and let's say payment gateway, payment system in another application, inventory in another application, user management in another application. So let's say we have 5 different applications for one product. We need to deploy all 5 applications into 5 different isolated environments. What do you mean by 5 different isolated environments? We need 5 different servers, right? Simply to say 5 different servers. But nowadays, how many servers will you procure when you wanted, like, different applications? You cannot, right? So you need to have a smaller isolated environment, which is Docker. You can imagine Docker is a minimized version of a server, a lightweight server, you can think, right? So the Docker and Kubernetes. Kubernetes is like we have Docker containers, how to manage and orchestrate the Docker effectively. That is with Kubernetes, right? So Kubernetes is a container orchestration tool, right? The entire Docker infrastructure is being managed by using Kubernetes technology. So this two itself really a big technology, guys. Like if you want to get master about these tools, right? You need at least 3 months to go at the infrastructure level. What are we going to see in this code? Because everybody might have it in your mind. Hey, Docker and Kubernetes itself a bigger concept. How will you cover all this into this code? We are not going to see at the very bigger infrastructure level, guys. Our focus is to take one application, learn each and every tool, get that deployed into Docker and Kubernetes. So we'll talk about how the Docker and Kubernetes architecture works, networking and everything. Do the hands-on on deploying our application into Docker container. Create a Docker file, create a Kubernetes cluster, deploy that into Kubernetes cluster. So all these operations will see. Also, Docker and Kubernetes needs some image, like how our laptop needs Windows operating system and Linux operating system. Similarly, Docker container also needs some image, right? So that image should be vulnerable free. That should have security compliant. So that's where the DevSecOps comes. We will also see about how the CAS benchmarking tools can be implemented for the Kubernetes cluster, right? How we will make sure the Docker container that we are creating is vulnerable free, how to do scanning for this Docker container. That's where we see about the DevSecOps tool as well. So when we talk about the Docker and Kubernetes, we'll understand about how we will deploy the application into Docker, how to create a Docker file, how to create a Kubernetes cluster basically, and how do we deploy our application into this Kubernetes cluster. So those concepts will cover here, right? And then let's say we deployed our application. And then we will talk about there's a concept called as Ansible. And what is Ansible? Ansible is basically a configuration management. We call it as configuration management tool. What is configuration management tool? Why Ansible is needed? Ansible is needed to manage n number of hosts. For example, you have 1,000 servers. Tomorrow, your boss is asking, hey, all 1,000 servers needs to have these 5 applications. So each and every server, you will not be able to log into each and every server and install all 5 applications, right? So you need an automation solution. What will you do for the automation solution? So the Ansible is a configuration management. You write some script here, right? We will write some playbooks. We call it as playbooks. What is playbooks? It's a script which will have some play. What is it going to do? It will have some task that we need to perform for all 1,000 servers. So let's say 5 tasks I want to perform. I want to install, I want to configure and do some kind of automation. I'll write it as a script, as playbook. I will execute against all 1,000 servers. So in fraction of second, I will be able to automate the entire stuff for all 1,000 servers, which is Ansible, right? So likewise, we have Ansible, SaltStack, Chef, Puppet, lot of tools we have it, guys. So we have picked Ansible because which is one of the most used tools in the industry, right? So how we will write the Ansible playbook, Ansible setup, everything we will learn in this session, right? Ansible is one tool which you can automate the infrastructure as well, right? It's really a big tool where it can manage thousands of infrastructure with the automation, right? And we talk about Terraform. I've mentioned it, right? Like this, I can cover where when I'm talking about the AWS itself, right? So we can learn about Terraform tool. Terraform is basically we call it as IAC. What is IAC? Which is infrastructure as a service. Sorry, I'm really sorry. Infrastructure as code. Infrastructure as code, as in what? What is infrastructure as code? I mentioned you, right? Like AWS is a service which provides all the infrastructure. Those infrastructure, we should never manage it manually. Why? Because we will lose a tracking basically. So we need to automate it. So how are we going to automate? This is one of the tools which will automate the infrastructure. So infrastructure as a code. Basically, we are going to manage the entire infrastructure via code. Why we need to manage the infrastructure via code? That's very, very important to understand, guys. Because let's say today you provisioned 500 servers. 500 servers are running. and 500 servers with some XYZ configuration. You mentioned it, right? Tomorrow you need to change the configuration for all the servers. If you have automated and put it in your code, right, you can just, it's a matter of just one line change and execute the code. It will manage the configuration for all. If you're trying to automate, if you're not trying to automate, you're just trying to do it manually, you have to perform each and everything manually, so which is very, very hectic. So how are we going to automate is what we'll see in this Terraform, right? Right. So we will talk about how we will write the Terraform code, how to do the plan and apply, how to do the disaster recovery management, everything, right? And then, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the security tool as well. We'll talk about Privy. Privy basically, it is there's a typo. So Privy is basically one of the the container security scanning tool. Basically, we'll scan the containers. How do we make sure our security of the container that we're trying to use, right? So we also have multiple tools. Basically, Docker security. How we will make sure that Docker security will make sure our static code analysis using KubeLinter. KubeLinter is one of the tool which will help you to analyze your code, guys. Like the static code analysis, where it will help you to understand the best practices that we have to follow in our company, right? So when I talk about the DevOps, right, you just go and Google DevOps, you will see this logo. What is this logo? So it's basically a continuous operation. So you will plan, you will code, you will build your code, test, release it, deploy it into the server, operate means like how we will make sure the operation of that infrastructure, and we will make sure the monitoring. Again, it's going to be following this thing. So why it is a continuous operation? It's going to be keep on doing the same thing. So that's why it is in this way, and making sure this is well protected by using security as that's what it is, right? So these are the things we'll be covering in this course. I've covered at the top level what are the topics we'll be covering, but in detail we have a bunch of things to cover as well, guys. That's very, very important. Don't just look at the topic I've told is very, very less, because each and every topic has its own expertise. As I mentioned, each and every topic, if you wanted to learn very detailedly, each and everything will take at least 2 3 months in order to learn it fully. But what we will be covering in this course for the next 2 to 2.5 months minimum, right? So it will take, the course duration will take at least 2 to 2.5 months, guys. It's something that we need to focus on the operating system aspect, the cloud aspect, the automation aspect, then the DevOps tools, right? So we have a bunch of things to cover in this particular course. So each and every topic is going to be following the hands-on, not on the theoretical. So today I prepared this because even my PPT does not have much information. Why? Because I don't want to dump you with all the information in the very beginning days, but I need to mention you what I'm going to cover in this particular course, right?